Hey everyone, this video is a little bit different. I originally put this together looking at the Jessica Lunsford Act, working with John over at J. Robine Law, which if you haven't checked that out, you absolutely should. It's J. Robine, R-O-B-I-N-E Law, over on YouTube if you want some good legal education. He does a lot of looking at laws and deep dive into criminal, not just criminal, but criminal and civil cases, as well as past cases and Supreme Court cases, all kinds of stuff. You would really enjoy it if you like that kind of stuff. But the Jessica Lunsford Act was a very big controversial act at the time, and the case behind the act, of course, was the disappearance and then murder of Jessica Lunsford. And that was something that was pretty impactful to my life at the time because I lived relatively near where it happened. I knew the area pretty well. I knew some of the people loosely connected to the investigation, and I actually had a daughter that was very close in age. So it was a rough one to know what happened and what went on. But it had been a long time since I had really read about the case and gone through it. So I dug up the information and put together just a little summary of what happened with the case and what the subsequent law that was passed very, very fast following her murder put in place, the restrictions it put in place for sex offenders. And it also impacts school district personnel, people who can be on school grounds, and quite a few other things. So take a look. Jessica Lunsford was a 9-year-old girl from Homosassa, Florida, a quaint town on the south side of Citrus County on Florida's Gulf Coast. The area boasts beautiful rivers and waterways and is the winter home to the adored sea cow, known as the Florida manatee. While there are tourists coming in and out of the area to relax on the water, load up on a bag full of scallops, or participate in a dozen of other local activities, they remain on the west side of the county close to the water. Locals have generally always felt safe from the crime that plagues big cities. Neighbors look out for one another, and children still play in the streets until the lights come on. Jessica lived in Homosassa with her father and grandparents. On the evening of February 23, 2005, Ruth kissed her granddaughter goodnight, never anticipating the horror that would overtake their lives in the coming days. The next morning, Ruth heard Jessica's alarm and went to see why Jessie, as she was affectionately known, was not turning it off. Ruth found Jessie's room undisturbed. There was no sign of the innocent 9-year-old girl. There were no signs of forced entry at the home or any indication as to where Jessica could have gone. Ruth called the local sheriff. The sheriff at the time was Jeff Dawsey, a widely popular elected official who would later come under scrutiny for alleged mistakes made during the investigation. While Ruth summoned help, Mark drove around the neighborhood calling for his daughter, unable to understand how she could have simply disappeared. The sheriff's office responded immediately, bringing in bloodhounds, helicopters, and the county's mounted posse unit to help search for Jessie. In the days that followed, the FBI and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children joined the Citrus County Sheriff's Office in the search. The media picked up on the story, and immediately the community responded as well. Hundreds of volunteers showed up to help search for Jessie, who seemed to have vanished into thin air. Local newspapers ran stories daily updating the progress of the search, and speculation about what happened to Jessie overtook the community. Former Atlanta Braves pitcher and hometown hero Mike Hampton offered $25,000 in reward to help find Jessica. More donors chipped in and brought the reward over $100,000. Mark Lunsford was frequently featured in news clips pleading for the return of his daughter. As days passed, the hopes of finding Jessie alive dwindled, but the search efforts continued and hundreds of volunteers searched daily for the little girl. Flyers were posted on every business and even mailed to residents. America's Most Wanted featured Jessica, hoping to spread awareness and find an answer. Every possible resource was used, yet there was no sign of Jessica Lunsford. There was talk of stopping the search, but the community refused to give up. There was anger at the inability of the sheriff's office to issue an Amber Alert, but with no sign of an abduction, Jessica's disappearance did not fit the criteria. Her disappearance prompted changes throughout the once safe community. Everyone was on high alert. Parents talked to their kids about Jessica's disappearance to show them that the stranger danger they had been taught years ago was real. With no solid evidence, rumors flew throughout the community of what could have possibly happened. Mark Lunsford ignored them and pressed on, pushing for help to find his daughter, holding on to the belief that she was still alive and could be found. Local companies donated door and window alarms that were distributed through the school system in the wake of Jessie's disappearance, hoping to calm fears of residents who still had no answers and worried for their own children's safety. The sheriff blamed the increase in local crime on the growing population in the area, and he insisted the community was still safe. Mark ignored the fodder and pressed on with the search. He even began organizing them himself from his parents' home. Days pressed on, 20 to be exact. Then it happened, the long-awaited break in the case. There was a suspect, and law enforcement was hot on his trail. It didn't take long before we saw the face of evil. John Evander Cooey, a sex offender who failed to register and lived in Homosassa. Detectives learned Cooey was staying with his sister just 100 yards from the Lunsford home. Cooey was questioned and fully confessed. Jessica Lunsford was dead. John Cooey had murdered her. Jessica's autopsy report revealed she died of asphyxiation from being buried alive. Her tiny wrists were tied with speaker wire. Her body was wrapped in trash bags. Cooey told investigators where to find her body on his sister's property, and that night, under the blazing floodlights, sheriff's deputies began to dig. They found her just as Cooey had said, her tiny fingers sticking out of the trash bag, holding on to her purple stuffed dolphin. Hearts collectively broke throughout the community as members came together to mourn the loss of one of their children. It was an unthinkable tragedy, and even more so for a small town that felt safe from this level of depravity. As more details emerged, the grief turned into rage. Cooey was a registered sex offender who should not have been staying at the home across the street from the Lunsfords. If proper procedures had been followed, notifications would have gone out about his presence in the area. Precautions could have been taken. Children could have been warned. And maybe Jessica could have been saved. There were 4 additional people arrested as part of the investigation into Cooey. Jean Allen Secord was arrested on charges of failure to pay child support. Maddie Catherine Secord was arrested after admittedly failing to inform deputies Cooey lived in the home and lying to deputies to protect him. Dorothy Marie Dixon, Cooey's sister, was charged with obstruction of justice and was accused of lying to deputies about Cooey living in the home. And Matthew Dietrich was charged with obstruction of justice by failing to turn Cooey in to authorities, even though he knew there was a warrant out for his arrest. These arrests did little to diffuse the growing rage. No amount of justice could account for the heinous kidnapping and murder, and there was outrage at those who seemingly helped to cover it up. The local paper ran a small map illustrating where Cooey was staying compared to the Lunsford's home, as well as where he was supposed to be living, over 5 miles away. These illustrations, along with a newer Google map, show how close Cooey was to the Lunsfords. Jessica was literally right across the street the entire time. So many questions surfaced, especially why wasn't Cooey staying where he was supposed to be staying, 5 miles away from where Jessica lived. Despite his confession, Cooey pled not guilty at trial, which was finally set to begin in 2007. It was moved to Miami due to the incredible amount of media attention that it had received in Citrus County. A small local newspaper The Citrus County Chronicle sent 5 reporters on the 5-hour trip from Citrus County to Miami to cover the story. On their website, they had daily reports, blogs, and covered every step of the trial for the public back home that was determined to see justice for Jessica. Sheriff Jeff Dawsey held a press conference near the Lunsford home, and ironically, the place where Jessica took her last breath. He called for the death penalty for Cooey. Most of the town agreed. Gawkers frequently drove by the home where Cooey once lived, needing to see for themselves where this tragedy took place. Some went out of morbid curiosity, others to understand, as if seeing the site in person would help them somehow comprehend the level of evil that was right next door. Throughout the trial, Cooey sat drawing intricate sketches, coloring and seeming disconnected to the retelling of his crimes. Mark Lunsford sat stoic, listening to details no father should ever have to hear about their child. The jury returned the verdict everyone had hoped for. Guilty on all counts. At last, some sense of justice was had for sweet Jessica. At a local bar and grill in Homosassa, where locals usually mingled and watched the game, the packed crowd huddled around televisions. The owner of the establishment grabbed a microphone and the crowd went silent. As he announced the guilty verdict, they erupted in cheers. The impact this senseless murder had on an entire community was astounding. Mark Lunsford didn't celebrate for long, though. He knew this was only step one. Justice would not be served until John Cooey was slated to suffer the same fate as Jessica. Hopefully, an old Sparky, Florida's electric chair. Mark needed to see justice for his daughter. It was all he had left to give her. As the penalty phase concluded, John Cooey sat emotionless as the verdict was read.
Madam Clerk, you may publish the recommendation.
In the Circuit Court of the 11th Judicial Circuit of the State of Florida, in and for Miami-Dade County, change of venue from the 5th Circuit, Citrus County. State of Florida versus Johnny Vander Cooey, case number 2005, CF 298. A majority of the jury, by a vote of 10 to 2, advise and recommend to the court that it impose the death penalty upon Johnny Vander Cooey for the murder of Jessica Marie Lunsford.
Death. The sentence all had hoped for. The justice Jessica Lunsford deserved. Following the trial, Mark took to the courthouse steps to greet the throng of reporters that were covering the case. Several jurors who usually were escorted out the back door of the courthouse and remained anonymous went to the steps. Some were crying. Others embraced Mark. Mark Lunsford's words to his daughter's killer: "Skip all the appeals and take your punishment. Be done with it." Cooey didn't listen to Mark's advice. He filed an appeal shortly after the trial. That appeal was never heard, though, as in 2009, John Cooey died of natural causes. The court's dismissal of the appeal due to Cooey's death closed the case. But was it really justice? The house where Cooey lived and committed his heinous crimes stood for some time, then mysteriously burned to the ground one evening. A relief for Jessica's grandparents, who still lived across the street and had to look at the monstrosity daily. During the years between Cooey's arrest and the trial, Mark Lunsford did not sit idly by and wait for justice. He used his newly found name recognition to get his voice heard and advocate for a bill that would tighten the penalties on sex offenders. Then Governor Jeb Bush, son of the former President George H.W. Bush and brother of former President George W. Bush, signed it into law with Mark by his side. The bill was prepared quickly after the details of Jessica's death at the hands of a sex offender became public. Lawmakers were rightfully outraged and had the ability to do something about it. Once a law, it became known as the Jessica Lunsford Act. It tightened the supervision and the penalties for sexual offenders and predators. One of the other requirements is background screening on all personnel who are permitted access onto school grounds when students are present and those who have contact with students. This provision came as a result of allegations that John Cooey worked on the grounds of one of the neighboring schools, potentially the one that Jessica attended. This law gave Florida one of the toughest child sex laws in the nation. Following its enactment, all but 8 other states enacted similar legislation. While Jessica's name has become synonymous with the law and its impacts, to her community, her name is a reminder that evil does exist in this world, and no matter how hard we try, sometimes it's impossible to prevent it, and it can be living right next door.